Wylam, 1981. The steam locomotive George Stephenson makes a ceremonial departure in honour of its namesake. George Stephenson, the father of the railways. He was born in this cottage here at Wylam exactly 200 years ago, and today the whole village is celebrating his bicentenary. To some folks, maybe, it's just another carnival, a chance to dress up and enjoy a sunny Saturday afternoon. But for the railway buffs and the local historians, the real pride that this is where the railways were born. And the round tablers who organise the event are even getting ducked for their hero. It's Wylam's big day, and George Stephenson would have loved it. But something's puzzling me. Whatever happened to his son, Robert, the other Stephenson? The man who's been forgotten for more than a century, yet whose railway achievements dwarfed those of his father. Why isn't all this Robert Stephenson's celebration? After all, he designed the best locomotives, he built the biggest railway in Britain, and the country its most dramatic bridges. But that's not all. He was buried in Westminster Abbey alongside the nation's great men. The only Geordie to get that honour, and the only commoner whose funeral procession passed through Hyde Park on Queen Victoria's personal say-so. He must have been a giant to those Victorians. But what do we know of the other Stephenson today?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. He was his brother, wasn't he? What, I don't know. Robert Stephenson was his brother.
He was his son.
Oh, son.
Robert Stephenson, he used to write books, didn't he, years ago?
Robert Louis Stephenson.
It was Treasure Island was one, wasn't it?
As my son, he has certainly had a considerable amount more education than I had, whereas I had to learn the hard way. He was able to attend school at Newcastle upon Tyne.
He was trained by George, he was educated by George. He went off to Central America to separate from his father.
Did he design the high-level bridge?
I think he did. And at a later time, of course, founded famous locomotive works at Fall Street, Newcastle, as well as building railways in other parts of this country and in other parts of the world.
Indeed he did, and much more besides. The story of Robert, the other Stephenson, started here, Westmore Cottage, Killingworth, 5 miles from Newcastle, and the home of the Stephenson family for 20 years. Throughout those years, Father George and son Robert worked together, studying, experimenting, inventing and making things, like the sundial over the cottage door. Britain was in the early grip of the Industrial Revolution, but still very rural. Round Tyneside, pits were sprouting alongside farms. The Tyne still had keels and tall-masted ships, and it took 5 days to get to London by horse and coach. Even so, Robert Stephenson's horizons were broadened from an early age. His demanding and inventive father made sure of that. His son was going to have what he hadn't, and education was top of the list. George paid for Robert to go to Bruce's Academy and the Lytton Phil in Newcastle. But once at home, they were always together, poring over books, discussing lessons, thrashing out problems, and George passed on all he knew about engines and the pit. Robert couldn't have had a better start in life, and his father arranged his first job, trainee viewer at Killingworth Pit. But his big chance came 2 years later, here on the Stockton and Darlington Railway as assistant surveyor to his father. That was a red-letter day, the start of Robert's career as a railway engineer. They spent autumn 1821 in the Durham countryside, mapping out the route. They walked along ridges like Bristleton here, deciding on the line, its embankments, the exact number of stone sleepers, the bridges, and the winding engine houses. The engine houses, like this one still standing at Bristleton, pulled the coal wagons up the 4 inclines on the route. The new steam locomotive engines could only operate on level ground. The 2 men carried out their work in record time, and then Robert surveyed the Hager-Leesers extension entirely on his own. And he was often in London, arguing the toss with hard-bitten parliamentary committees. But by now, Robert was enjoying his independence, and after spending 2 terms at Edinburgh University, he was ready for bigger things. Robert was becoming so capable that by the time he was only 20, he was the boss of the family firm, set up to build engines by George, Robert, and 2 partners. The name on the side of these 4th Street works in Newcastle was Robert Stephenson and Company. Young Bobby was no longer in Dad's shadow. In fact, he was even starting to eclipse him. He'd raised his own stake in the business, and his job description showed that 4th Street's success depended entirely upon him. As it says, he had to supervise the building operations, engage men, take orders, advise on contracts and draw plans, make estimates, and even keep the accounts, and in all matters, great and small, governed the young establishment on his own responsibility. He did, and his first order was for equipment: bellows, anvils, vices, and 3 lathes. The family firm was on the way. But after only 1 year in the job, Robert realized that he might be tied down here at 4th Street for the rest of his life. He wanted to experience the world, a bit of travel, before he finally settled down. To him, South America was the perfect challenge. In those days, South America offered great opportunities in the gold and silver mines, which fired Robert's imagination. He accepted a job as engineer to the Colombian Mining Association, and though Father George objected, Robert was dead set on going. He went for 3 years and had to cope with far more than he'd expected. The Santa Ana mines were no El Dorado. There were few roads, the wrong machinery was sent out, and as the young boss, he had to deal with tough, drunken Cornish miners. These navvies thought their weakling of a boss, with his white hat and his floppy suit, was easy meat. But Robert was tough too. In 3 hard years, he won them over, and that made him a success. When Robert came back, 4th Street here was in a mess. There were orders for engines, spare parts, and a few wheels, but there's a chronic shortage of working capital. Father George was also away surveying railways, so there's no technical management or planning. Paperwork was piling up. It was all over the place. In fact, there's even talk of winding up the whole business. Robert's return changed that. He made an immediate impact with his energy, foresight, and damn good business sense. Soon he'd got a works manager, chief draftsman, and chief clerk. Trusted workers were given jobs. Discipline was tightened up. Thereafter, new orders. Businessman Robert was out to make money. But above all, he wanted new locomotives. Ones which would make sure the Stephensons led this great, exciting age. The locomotion here, the apple of his father's eye, was old-fashioned to Robert. In less than 5 years, these black, noisy, unsprung locomotives were to be transformed into fleet, efficient engines, the models for all later steam locomotives. 4th Street was building for obsolescence. No sooner were 4 different models on the same factory floor than new designs were coming hot off the drawing board. Each locomotive had some new feature or design, but Four major developments marked 4th Street production under Robert Stephenson's push. First was the rocket, built in 1830 for the Rainhill trials at Liverpool. The rocket was light and streamlined, and its multitubular boiler increased the heating surface using hot gases better before they shot up the blast pipe. Changes happened so quickly that the rocket was soon obsolete. It lasted only 10 years and became a museum piece, as did the very last engine in the rocket class, the Northumbrian, the first ever locomotive to have the firebox as an integral part of the boiler. And that became obsolete in just 2 years. The second development was the Patentee, built in 1833 to become the basic design of the 6-wheeled locomotive. It had a larger boiler, longer firebox, and the first ever steam brake. At 17 tons, the Patentee was the largest locomotive yet built. Thirdly, the long boiler engine, built in 1841. It solved overheating problems by lengthening the boiler and had 3 axles in front of the firebox. A popular goods locomotive, widely exported to the continent. The fourth development was the Stephenson Link valve gear of 1841, and patented by Robert Stephenson a year later. This gave increased power and efficiency by extracting more energy from a locomotive's steam, allowing also for easy reversing. It became a standard fitting in the second half of the 19th century and was the end product of a 20-year 4th Street design policy which produced the best locomotives in Britain. Robert's push and inventiveness had left his father and his locomotives far behind, and they gave the world this kind of scene, the glory of the latter-day steam train. It all paid off. The works supplied most railways in Britain and exported to Europe, the Middle East, Asia and America. In 1846, there were 224 locomotives on order at £2,000 each. 4th Street also made marine engines and boilers, and pit engines were another part of the output. All this put together, the company boomed in that prolific 20-year period. It was the first locomotive works in the world, and Robert Stephenson was in charge of it. Building railways in those days was a tough business. It was done by pick and shovel. But Robert Stephenson was to tackle the biggest engineering task the world had seen. A task, they reckoned, which made the pyramids puny by comparison. That job was right here, the 112-mile London to Birmingham Railway, the first to give Londoners their trains and the giant of them all. If taken all the soil from these works and stacked it 1.5 feet deep, it would have circled the equator 3 times. Just before his 30th birthday, the age at which his father was still an obscure engine wright, a fellow engineer wrote to him.
This may serve as a model for all future railways and become the wonder of posterity. Remember, faint heart never won fair lady. Climb boldly then.
Boldness was needed to build any railway in those days, but the London to Birmingham was as great an engineering feat as building the M1 motorway today, without modern technology. It was on this railway that Robert Stephenson became known as the Chief. Clear and decisive, martial bearing, piercing eyes, commanding the respect of tough navvies, just as he had in South America. Christmas of 1834 at Wolverton Bank was typical of this determined man. The Chief needed 1,000 tons of earth for the embankments here at Wolverton, near Milton Keynes. But first, he had to get that earth across this canal, the old Grand Junction. When he wanted to build a temporary bridge to do that, rival canal owners refused him permission. So, armed with gangs of navvies and engineered torches, he was determined to show mere canal owners how. With everybody mucking in together, they built the bridge, without permission, in 48 hours, finishing at noon on Christmas Day. The infuriated canal owners tore it down, but the next bridge was protected by a court injunction, and Stephenson himself sat through the entire hearing. But Wolverton was a small problem compared with those the chief faced at Kilsby. The saga of the tunnel near Rugby is part of engineering legend, the place where Robert Stephenson fought an epic 4-year battle. And Dr. Arnold, the headmaster of nearby Rugby School, told him,
I understand you carry your line through those hills. I confess I shall be much surprised if they do not give you some trouble.
Prophetic words. This tunnel and its problems were colossal. Kilsby Tunnel is 1.5 miles long, and today the mainline electrics still thunder through it day and night, echoing up the huge air shafts that still stand in the fields above. Ventilation was Stephenson's biggest problem. Back in the 1830s, they started cutting 100-foot deep shafts into the workings, but 3 of them hit underground streams and quicksands. The whole lot caved in and flooded, not just once, but time and time again. The works were a disaster, impossible to build, but when the directors panicked, the chief assured them that he could pump the water out. 1,200 navvies toiled for months on end, with 200 horses, pumping the tunnel dry and laying 36 million lining bricks inside. So committed were the navvies to their chief that work never stopped for injured mates. They were pushed to one side, volunteers filled the gaps, new men rushed down from the shantytown on the ridge. The message was simple. Come on, lads, come on, get stuck in. The work went on, but it took 1.5 years to beat the gushing streams and quicksands of Kilsby Ridge. When this tunnel was completed in June 1838, and the whole railway 3 months later, the wonder of the age was finished. The chief had built his pyramids. The chief's staff laid on a celebration dinner at the Duncow pub at nearby Dunchurch. A great honour. All the big names were there, and Father George travelled from Derbyshire to share in Robert's success. And in the middle of it was the chief, moved to tears. But when he staggered to bed at 2 o'clock, he was on top of the world. He'd been wined and dined by the best engineers of the day. His reputation was made. Robert Stephenson had become a public figure, and he'd got his new office in Great George Street, Westminster, a model of success and prosperity. But he was soon to go through 2 disasters which almost ruined him. And the first came just 1 year after he'd beaten Kilsby. It looks magnificent, doesn't it? The best that railway architecture can offer. But it was part of an ill-fated railway which nearly wrecked Robert Stephenson, and now the newspapers were waiting for his fall. This is the Stanhope-on-Tyne Railway. It went from the old Stanhope Limeworks via Concert to the Deepwater Stays at South Shields. It used every form of motive-power known when it was completed in 1832. It also crossed Hounsgill Ravine here, near Concert, first by rope haulage and later by this 150-foot-high viaduct. An exciting challenge at the time, but one which Robert paid for dearly. As consultant engineer, He'd accepted 5 £100 shares as his fee, but when the company collapsed 7 years later, he found out he was the principal shareholder. Those bits of paper he'd forgotten about forced him to meet the entire liability himself. He lost £20,000 and even had to sell half his shares in the family business to his father to raise the money. Robert Stephenson vowed never to fall into the same trap again. 6 years later, a disaster of a different kind almost sent him to jail. It happened on the other side of the country on his Chester to Holyhead railway. For his bridge over the River Dee there, he'd built with cast iron, a brittle metal which engineers like Brunel never used. 6 months after the opening in 1847, one of the arches shattered, plunging the train and coaches into the river below. 5 people died, and the papers called it a disaster. An inquiry was held. The local surveyor wanted him charged with manslaughter. Stephenson knew he'd committed a serious error, and 5 people had been killed because of it. He was close to ruin, but so respected was he that engineers like Brunel and Locke rallied round and refused to condemn Bobby Stephenson or his Dee Bridge. The case of negligence was not proven. Despite that disaster, it was his work on railway bridges that sealed Robert Stephenson's reputation. There were 2 gaps in the East Coast rail route from London to Edinburgh, and Stephenson was appointed engineer-in-chief for both, the Darlington-Newcastle and the Newcastle-Berwick railways, with bridges over the Tyne at Newcastle and over the Tweed at Berwick. Those commissions brought the great engineer home to Tyneside to span the river with his high-level bridge. Stephenson put great care into his design. 2 decks of traffic crossing the river, 120 feet up, using the bow and string girder design, the tops of those bows carrying the railway and the horizontal strings the roadway. Underneath the waterline was another unique feature, the 40-foot piles which support these arches, and which were driven into place by James Naismith's steam hammer, the first major bridge in Britain to use a power-driven pile driver. All that ironwork, 5,000 tons of it, came across the river from the Gateshead foundries. Iron which today supports loads even the chief never dreamed of. When completed in 1849, the bridge attracted a lot of attention. It was opened by Queen Victoria herself and was the first railway across the Tyne. To Newcastle people, it was a great day. No longer did 500,000 southbound travellers each year have to catch scullerboat ferries or cross the old Tyne Bridge to get to Gateshead station. Now they had their own trains. The last link in this 2 capitals route was the Royal Border Bridge at Berwick. A dramatic river crossing, still used today by the latest high-speed trains. But his masterpiece of new bridge design was the Britannia in North Wales, using metal tubes resting on piers high above the Menai Straits. The bridge was built in 1850, after the now cautious engineer had tested a 75-foot scale model of his designs first. His Britannia stands near Telford's Menai Straits Bridge, and both are still in use today. After Britannia, he built one other, the Victoria Bridge across the St. Lawrence River at Montreal in 1859, and by any standards, a giant, twice as long as the new Humber Bridge and still in use today. Robert Stephenson died just 6 weeks before it was finished. He was only 56 years of age. This photograph, the only one ever taken of him, shows the effects of hard work and responsibility, and perhaps it shows some personal sadness too. Robert Stephenson had married Fanny Sanderson, and they'd set up house here in Greenfield Place, Newcastle. Later they moved to Hampstead, where Fanny died of cancer, A double blow because the couple had no children. Robert never remarried, but to the end he regarded his brief years with Fanny at Greenfield Place as the happiest in his life. Workaholic, man in a hurry, dreamer and brilliant engineer, Robert Stephenson was all of these things. He loved the limelight of being the best. And why not? His driving force was his work, the bridges, tunnels and railway routes that he built to last. That's something worth thinking about. Take the M1 today. Built by the best modern technology, it's always having to be repaired, and it's only 25 years old. Robert Stephenson's tunnels and bridges, built by hand, pick and shovel, are still going strong after a century and a half. In 1857, Robert Stephenson made his last visit to Tyneside. As he walked from his hotel to go to the 4th Street Works for the last time, dozens of people came to shake his hand. He tapped on the door of the Westmore cottage at Killingworth and crossed the threshold to see where it had all begun. And he came here to Wylam to pay tribute at the cottage where his father had been born. His father, George Stephenson, who'd started him off in life. People at Wylam also pay tribute to George Stephenson, a great pioneer. But it was a damn sight harder for his son to become great. The railways weren't new anymore, so he had to build them bigger and better, with more planning, more skill, and more competition than his father ever had. That's why they buried Robert Stephenson in Westminster Abbey, a Victorian hero. The funny thing is, though, today he's forgotten, a kind of also-ran who gets second prize in railway celebrations, partly through his dad being first, and also because his death marked the end of railway pioneers and a great railway age. The next century, this one, gave us new heroes to admire. Well, I think it's time that changed. Without Robert, the other Stephenson, the blueprints for the railways, engines and bridges of this century might never have been drawn.